Hello and welcome to today's edition of Spec Steppin, where we are stepping through the web API spec. In today's episode, we're going to cover the document object model. Now, if you've been developing for any amount of time, you have interacted with the document object model. Now, if you are a newer, like a junior dev, you may not have realized it was a document object model because a lot of times you learn about methods and things with interacting with the document object model before you even learn what the DOM is. So this I'm going to give you an overview, but what you'll notice is there'll be like this light bulb moment if you're a junior dev where you're like, oh, yeah, I've been using that already. I didn't realize it was a part of the DOM. But now, also, you should know that the document object model, while most often you interact with an HTML document, but HTML comes from like the same parent as like XML and SVG. So you can interact with SVG documents and XML documents. Now, why would you know? Most often you'll do HTML to be fair. But why would you want to do the others? Well, if you are creating an XML document, like for an API, if you're serving up XML instead of JSON, you can use JavaScript to help do that. The other thing is SVGs for scalable vector graphics. Why in the world would you do that? Well, you could interact with that SVG and change that graphic. For example, you could make it move and make it animated with JavaScript, things like that. So there's really some interesting usages beyond just HTML, but HTML is probably what you'll work with the most. Now, think of the document object model like a tree. So in an HTML doc, if let me switch over to my code here real quick. So in my HTML doc, we use indentations and things so that we can read the document, but really that's creating our tree. It's just on its side. So we have the overview, overall HTML, and then we have underneath that HTML. So we have the HTML underneath that we have the head and the body, and then underneath that we have H1 div button here. We have meta, title, link, script, those sorts of things. So we can think of the DOM structure as a tree. Now, most often you're going to interact with the body because that's what the end user is going to see. So that's the most often what you're going to use. So you'll have these, sometimes you'll hear the term nodes, tree nodes and elements and things like that. Sometimes those phrases are used interchangeably. So you need to understand the context within which node or element is going to be used because they're not really equivalent. There's nuanced differences, but for the most often they're used interchangeably. So basically the DOM allows you to interact with that HTML structure, that model that it gives you. Now, we've already been interacting with it with using like query selector. So if you use query selector all, query selector, get element by ID, you're working with the DOM. You're working with the DOM API. If you're adding an event listener or listen to content loaded, all that sort of stuff, you are already interacting with the DOM. That's why I said earlier, a lot of times when developers are first starting out, before they learn about the DOM, they're interacting with the DOM. So here it talks about the tree. I'm not going to go through all that. I basically just did. A lot of times you'll see it grafted out. JavaScript, although it's not the only one, like you can see here, you can use Python, but JavaScript's most often used. Here's an example of doing it within the HTML. You can do that, and that's a good technique to know, a good tool to have in your tool belt if necessary. But most often, you're going to interact with it from an external JavaScript file just for separation of concerns and clean code. So there's a whole bunch of interfaces and things that you can use, any events, text, all that stuff you can interact with. So here's an example where they're using get element by ID. They're creating nodes and all that stuff, creating text. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here. But let me just give you a quick overview in my code here. So I have just some basic styles, nothing really fancy. And then I have my JavaScript, but I have just a heading. But then I have a demo box that I just have some styles. That's where the interaction is going to take place. And I have two buttons that are going to actually affect the DOM. So let me jump over here. And I have just some console logs here. So I have grabbed the box ID. The initial content says this is a demo box, nothing really fancy there. But I can click change box and watch what happens. So I changed the content of the box from this is a demo box to the box has been changed. I can also add a paragraph, and boom, I added a paragraph right underneath my box. Now, if I reload just to show you again, change box, add paragraph. Now, how does that work? Well, if I go back over here, first thing, I'm interacting with the DOM by adding an event listener of DOM content loaded. I want to wait and make sure all the content's loaded before I interact with it. If you've watched any of my videos, you see me do that technique quite often. And here I'm interacting with the DOM by using query selector, the document query selector, where I'm just grabbing the demo box, I'm grabbing the change button, I'm grabbing the add button. Okay. Then I'm interacting with the DOM again by adding an event listener of click onto my change button, and I add an event listener click onto my add button. Again, interacting with the DOM. And here I'm getting into the properties. Here are my properties of my box, which is my demo box, and I'm changing the text content to the box has been changed. Now, let me just do a little side note here. In some instances, some demos, some code and stuff like that, you will see a property used called inner HTML. Text content only allows you to do text. Inner HTML allows you to do text, but also HTML markup. Now, it's cool to be able to allow you to use inner HTML. However, I do not believe it's officially a part of the spec, at least last time I looked. Maybe they've added it since I've looked. It's been a while since I looked at the actual spec. But when I looked, it was not an official part of the spec. And there are some possible security issues in using inner HTML. It all depends on how it's being used and where it's being used and things like that, because you can inject code into that inner HTML. So, for example, if it renders and evaluates HTML code and you have embedded script in your head, like, you can put script up here. There's potential issues there. So I just personally, I stay away from inner HTML altogether. There's no reason to use it. Yes, it would make some things a little less verbose, but to me, I'd rather have more verbosity than to deal with security issues. So like text content, I can't put in any HTML in here. There's other ways I can create attributes and stuff like that. So for example, here I have text content right here. I have a class list where I can change the background, and I don't know if I even added that style here. Yes, I did. Added the style highlight. So you can toggle the CSS to change the background. That's what I did there. Class list is another part of the DOM API. Here, set attribute. So I'm adding an attribute. So instead of taking and creating the HTML and using inner HTML and putting attributes in there, there's other methods that do that are safer to use. So then I'm doing the same thing with add button. Here, though, I'm using another DOM API method, create element. So again, instead of doing inner HTML, I can actually use a method to create an element. And here I'm creating a paragraph tag. And then here I'm telling it to change the text content to whatever I have in here. And then I'm using this method, insert adjacent element, where I'm telling it after the end, add in that new paragraph. That's why it went after my box, my demo box. And I just have a couple console logs. So if we go back and look, let me just refresh here, change my box, and then add paragraph, and it adds it right after my demo box. So those are just some very, very simplistic examples on how we can work with the DOM. This is one that you will use constantly. I use the DOM all the time. I don't know how you would get around not using the DOM API when building a web application. I just don't know how you do it. But so you're going to use this a ton. So I would get familiar with this one as opposed to some of the other ones I've covered. Some of them, especially the experimental ones, are more obscure. This is one that you need to know. So if you've not ever read through the spec on the MDN site, I would encourage you to read through this. Make sure you know this. There's a bunch of information that you can glean from this that will make you be able to access a bunch of things within your web apps and be able to do a bunch of cool stuff. So if you have any questions, let me know. And if not, happy stepping.